I think we've all heard the notion that the brain isn't fully developed until age 25. It's something I've certainly said even on this channel over and over again. But today I'd like to talk about some of the nuances around that, because there is a growing amount of pushback to this rhetoric, particularly in the field of developmental neuroscience. Because while yes, the brain definitely continues maturing into our mid-20s, especially the prefrontal cortex, which deals with things like planning, executive control, decision-making, impulse control, there's a growing amount of evidence that part of what shapes that development is life experiences themselves. So we need to be a little bit wary of narratives that coddle and infantilize young adults, that try to strip them of gaining those environmental exposures that ironically help them develop. In today's video, I'll be sharing how infantilizing young adults can delay their brain development, in what ways I think young adults are infantilized today, and what we need to change about the way that we address young adulthood as a developmental stage in a person's lifespan. As always, I'd love to hear your experiences down in the comments below. Have you or somebody else you know been coddled even as an adult? Tell me about it. In what ways are young adults infantilized these days? Gen Z has been delaying a lot of milestones. It's been documented in questionnaire after questionnaire, study after study, that Gen Z tends to be delaying employment, at what age they become sexually active, dating, moving out of their parents' house, getting married, having kids. And if that's their choice, then that's fine. But there are a lot of young people who feel sort of stuck in this stage of arrested development, not necessarily of their own volition. Now, Gen Z typically cites systemic barriers as to why they aren't able to do certain adult things, like economic instability, the pandemic, and so forth. And yes, systemic barriers absolutely play a role. For example, economic instability makes it harder for Gen Z to be able to afford moving out of their parents' house. The pandemic hindered teenagers' development of social skills, which makes it harder for them to make friends, to date, and so on. However, I do want to point out that this is absolutely not the only time in history when young adults were faced with systemic barriers. Whether it was the Cold War, when Americans and Russians alike feared mutually assured destruction, any number of wars where people feared men being drafted, the countless dictatorships, communist and fascist and everything in between, that have held different countries in severe poverty and totalitarianism, the world wars, the plagues, the witch trials, foreign invasions, on and on and on. And even in modern times, there are plenty of places in the world where there is extreme anguish. Despite this, putting adulthood on hold is not something that young adults are doing in those places. And in fact, I would argue that they can't afford to put adulthood on hold there, because extreme stressors are forcing them to grow up faster. And yet we hear kind of this running joke that adulting is hard among particularly Western young adults. There's also been a documented decrease in risk-taking behaviors and a preference for safety, not only just physical safety, but also what young adults reference as emotional safety. And in my opinion, the reason Gen Z is struggling so much with these more adult responsibilities is because they have been infantilized a lot by older generations. And this is called the paradox of progress, which is when there are inadvertent drawbacks to changes that are actually good. Unlike the more, shall we say, free-range, sometimes neglectful parenting that Gen X received, Gen Z was raised by parents who are very preoccupied with their safety and minimizing any sort of discomfort. And there are pendulum swings like this across history with everything, but it even happens with parenting styles. Like you see sometimes authoritarian parenting styles in one generation, they're super popular, and then in the next generation, super permissive parenting styles are popular. With anything, there are trade-offs, and it's not a matter of one being better or worse. I certainly wouldn't argue that having neglectful parents is better for people, but rather that we need to be mindful of the potential drawbacks that could come up when the pendulum swings, and to sort of counterbalance them so we reach a state of equilibrium again. So in this case, I think younger adults are taking longer to grow up because safety is being prioritized over learning from mistakes, over taking risks and learning from when you fall down. This was why young adulthood lately has been called a period of delayed adulthood or extended adolescence. It's why job recruiters, for instance, have testimonies expressing concerns about how Gen Z shows up to interviews with their parents, or how you'll hear, people that are like 28 to 30 years old saying that they feel like they're having a teenage pregnancy.
I'm 27 years old, but in my head, if I were to get pregnant right now, today, I would feel like it was a teen pregnancy.
Another example of infantilization is the segregation of child life versus adult life in particularly the United States, which results in children not really being exposed to adult things and activities early on. And this is very strange to me as a European. This is most definitely not how I will be raising my children. You know, like when I hear some of the limitations that American parents talk about with regards to parenting, like, oh, you can never do anything, you can never socialize, you can never travel anymore. It's like, I'm sorry, why? Why can't you take your child with you on happy hour on a patio? Why can't you hop on a plane with them? There is this extreme separation between children and adults. And I think it's getting a lot of people really bold in expressing their contempt for children.
Now, this story is coming from a real situation where a passenger was upset because they were sitting next to a kid in first class.
Hey, here's y'all's reminder that the more kid-free spaces we have, the fewer women you will see in public.
And another example of the infantilization I've seen taking place is this notion that young adults can't consent to anything until age 25. There's a whole faction of individuals who believe anyone under 25 should not have any sort of age gap, like not even a few years, that they shouldn't even be allowed to drink alcohol, can't vote, can't consent to sexual encounters. And the paradox here is that the brain is underdeveloped until age 25, but the brain needs to grow from experiences in order to develop. And this is where I think Nara Smith can provide a really good case study of the way that we infantilize young adults. If you don't know who Nara Smith is, she's a model and content creator who's amassed a massive following on TikTok for her elaborate, over-the-top recipes. She comes on screen, usually wearing something ridiculously fancy, and makes food from scratch for her family. Nara Smith is currently 23 years old, and she's just recently announced that she's pregnant with her 4th child. And unfortunately, the internet's reaction has been quite disappointing. Instead of just giving a normal congrats or scrolling on by, people have taken Nara's pregnancy announcement as an opportunity to debate the morality of her having another child. One of the main arguments is that she's too young to be a mom. She had her first child at age 19, and people are arguing that she was way too young to make a decision like that back then, and she's still too young to make a decision like that now because she's under 25, so her frontal lobe isn't fully developed. Another argument I keep hearing is that she's pushing a conservative tradwife lifestyle onto her impressionable female followers. Apparently, the fact that Nara likes to cook for her family makes her some sort of conservative shill, and her followers are just brain-dead, easily manipulated women who imitate whatever they see online. Even though there's literally so much about Nara's family structure that isn't traditional, her husband has a child from a previous relationship, they're in an interracial marriage, Nara is filthy rich and likely the main breadwinner of her family, her husband also cooks for them, both of them are also successful models. I've even seen content creators accuse her of being Mormon, even though she's literally come out and said she doesn't identify as Mormon, and then I've seen some of those content creators admitting Nara blocked them for accusing her of being Mormon, but then they go on and make more videos where they accuse her of being irresponsible because of her life decisions to have children young. Which, like, side note, can I just mention how gross that feels to me? Like, if this were happening in real life and someone kept criticizing your life decisions to anyone who would listen, so you quietly removed them from your life, and then that person were to continue criticizing your life decisions to anyone who would listen, wouldn't we all agree that that person needs to get a life and stop focusing so much on what other people are doing? Like, I don't know, I feel like the same rules should apply online. If someone blocks you because you won't stop chirping them, that might be time to stop chirping them, not to double down. Anyway, side note over, I think this Nara Smith situation really highlights how much we've come to infantilize young adults. Like, look, do I think 19 is an extremely young age to have children? Absolutely. At 19 years old, I was nowhere near mature enough to have a child. I had so much work to do in terms of regulating my own emotions, learning healthy relationship skills. I was in school, I had no money of my own. I wouldn't have been able to balance both school and a child. But we need to remember that not everyone develops at the same rate. I might not have been ready for that life milestone then, but other people could be. Like, I'm pretty sure one of my grandmas had her first child at 19. Not everyone is in school at 19. Some people are wealthy enough to afford having a child that young. And I wonder if that might be part of what's getting triggered for people with this whole Nara Smith situation. They see a gorgeous, extremely successful 23-year-old and it makes them feel behind in life because a lot of people are behind. A lot of people are not doing things that they would have wanted to have been doing by this age. But since they can't attack her for building her wealth very young or having a very clear sense of who she is, they attack something that's more conventionally acceptable to attack. That she's too young to have kids, she's too young to get married, she's a tradwife in disguise because she had kids young and she likes to cook for her family. I really feel like we have lost the plot here. The people criticizing Nara act like they are the agents of feminism, watching out for insidious tradwife propaganda that will eventually strip women of their choices, but they're ironically the ones resorting to misogyny. Because if you zoom out, you see how ridiculous this criticism is. They're judging a grown woman of legal age for her reproductive choices. There is nothing feminist about that. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a choice feminist, meaning I don't think anything a woman chooses to do is feminist. But I do think infantilizing a grown woman for the way she runs her family is misogynistic. She's not hurting anyone by having kids young and cooking for her family. Let's get it together. So developmental neuroscience acknowledges that the brain matures not just through the passing of time, but also because of life experiences, environment, and culture. Both human and animal studies have demonstrated that stimulating environments lead to neural development. For example, I don't like talking about the study. I hate that it is the only thing associated with Romania in the field of psychology, but in the 20th century, there was a big Romanian orphanage study, which looked at all these orphans in Romania who were created by the lack of contraception during the communist dictatorship. They were deeply understimulated in these orphanages. There was a lack of cognitive, social, sensory stimulation, and those children ended up having smaller brain volume, lower IQ, language deficits, issues with executive functioning, emotional issues like depression and anxiety, even things like having a colorful environment, interacting with humans, hearing different sounds impact how well a child is going to develop. And this happens in young adulthood too. If you don't have some of those challenging experiences that kind of kick you in the butt, then you're never fully going to develop your brain if you're just kind of like avoiding them indefinitely. Another really important concept in developmental neuroscience is the concept of neuroplasticity, which is the discovery that the brain is pretty elastic. It forms certain pathways in response to environmental stimuli across the lifespan, even well past age 25. People of any age can and do recover cognitive, motor, linguistic function after a stroke. Other parts of the brain compensate for the damaged parts. There was another really interesting study out of London looking at taxi drivers. Taxi drivers had larger hippocampi. Hippocampi are associated with memory and also with spatial awareness. And because they were constantly practicing spatial awareness and remembering where things were in the city on a map, their hippocampi got stronger. We also know that there's increased activity in the language areas of the brain for people learning a new language, even well into adulthood, and that meditation impacts brain activity even after just a few weeks, that it impacts the limbic system, which is responsible for the more emotional centers of life, to be less reactive. When adults learn a new instrument, not just children, their corpus callosum gets bigger. So this notion that the brain is ever fully mature or complete or cooked is an incorrect one. The brain might be mainly matured by mid-20s, but ideally we keep growing and changing and strengthening neurologically throughout our lives. And when we don't do that, that's when things like neurodegenerative disorders like dementia pop up. And I think that's actually why a lot of neurodegenerative disorders pop up and why a lot of people get sort of cognitive decline with age is because they're not exposing themselves anymore when they're in retirement. They think that retirement is just the time to kind of get complacent, just relax, do nothing, and they're no longer stimulating their brain. Other ways that the brain continues to develop and mature across the lifespan: myelination continues into our 30s and 40s. Myelin is the fatty sheath around neurons that speed up signal transmission. Well into the 30s and 40s, people tend to deepen their empathy and their emotion regulation and their insight. White matter tends to increase in mid-adulthood. There's more sophisticated moral reasoning and abstract thinking as you get deeper into your life. So how do we balance the two halves of this paradox? How should we talk about young adults knowing that they're not yet fully mature from a neurological standpoint, but they need life experiences in order to get that maturity? I think the main thing we need to remember is that development is gradual. There's no magical age at which someone is suddenly an adult and has the right to do whatever they want, or suddenly goes from being 0% responsible for themselves to being 100% responsible for themselves. You know, when I think about my own development, I definitely think that like around age 25, I experienced a lot of growth, but I also experienced a lot of growth at age 21. I also experienced a lot of growth the years after age 25. And actually, when I really sit down and think about what preceded those biggest developments, it was usually a very big change and stressor in my life. It was usually something environmental that triggered me stepping into a deeper stage of development. So when people say things to kids or minors like, oh, you can make blank decision about your life, like you can decide how to decorate your house or whether you want to dye your hair when you're 18, it doesn't quite make sense. Nothing is going to magically change when that person turns 18. They don't go from being 0% responsible to 100% responsible. And in fact, it's important to encourage children taking age-appropriate responsibilities and risks on, like letting a 2-year-old maybe go down a slide on their own if they've proven capable of it, or letting an 8-year-old take responsibility of running a lemonade stand, or letting a 10-year-old learn sex education in school. What counts as age appropriate is somewhat subjective and culture bound. So I'm not going to pretend I have the answer, but let me just ask you then. At what age do you think we should allow the age of consent? At what age should we allow people to drink alcohol, people to vote, people to enlist in the army? After recording this video, I was talking with my husband about these questions, and while talking about it, I realized these ages should be kind of like a minimum threshold, right? It doesn't mean that everyone is necessarily ready to do all these things at those ages, but it is the age at which if people are ready, they should be able to. I think these benchmarks should be minimums and not necessarily that we should see them as like, oh, everyone at this age must be ready to do these things. At what age do you think it should be acceptable to get a job, move out of your parents' house, get married, have kids if you want to? I don't know that there's a right or wrong age. What I do know, though, is that if we keep pushing back these norms and sort of pathologizing people doing things early on in their lives, we're going to get generations that are just further and further delayed in their development. Like there's actually a theory running right now that now the brain matures at age 25, but back in older times when people were, married with kids by 22, that their brains might have been fully developed earlier and we just didn't have the science to really test it. And if we keep infantilizing young adults, are their brains just going to continue maturing slower and slower, later and later? And I think it's not just about age either, but also about the individual. Has this individual mastered their previous levels of development, and are they ready to move on to the next one? Like the example I gave of like a 2-year-old is ready to go down the slide on their own. Well, okay, like that depends on the 2-year-old. Like, have they shown that they're able to balance themselves when you do it with them? Or are they still very much in need of some scaffolding there? Like, it's individual dependent as well, but development has to be gradual. It's not a 0 to 100 thing, and it has to be tailored to the person's specific skills and capabilities. And one last thought, remember how I was talking earlier about how Gen Z was overprotected by their parents and made to very strongly prioritize safety? I feel like this may be part of what we're seeing here. It can be scary to move out of your parents' house, to start dating, to get a job, to get married, to have kids, to move to a new city, to switch careers, or whatever other life goal you have for yourself that feels new and unfamiliar. But I think my generation needs to remember that we grow as a result of scary life experiences. Without those life experiences, we stagnate. We remain static. We fall behind compared to what we had envisioned for ourselves. So when we see someone like Nara Smith having her 4th child at age 23 and we think, oh my God, there are so many things that could go wrong. Yes, and that is okay. Maybe her marriage won't last. Maybe having 4 kids will be extremely hard. But you know what? Even if that is the case, it will only make her grow even stronger. It will only help her develop as a person. Stop letting fear of what could go wrong stop you from doing the things you wanted for yourself. Stop letting the allure of emotional safety trap you into never getting out of your comfort zone. Stop worrying that you'll get hurt. Yes, you will get hurt. It's not a matter of if, but when. And when you do, you will grow immensely as a person. Anyway, I thought this was an interesting nuance because we often hear about this notion that, the brain's not fully cooked till age 25. And it's just important to remember that part of the reason for that is you need certain experiences in order to fully develop. So if you're a young adult, don't be afraid to experience life early on because that's going to help you mature. No one is born mature. They become mature through experiences and time. Let me know what you thought of this topic. See you soon.